Harlem, New York. The New York Police Department's 23rd Precinct received 8 murder reports between Sunday, September 15th, and Friday, September 20th, 1,935, all involving white men who worked for Dutch Schultz's numbers organization in Harlem, all killed execution style, with notes pinned to their bodies, counting down from 7 to go to Harlem is ours, creating what Detective Lieutenant Francis O'Sullivan, 42, described in his official report as a systematic campaign of targeted assassinations executed with military precision and leaving no physical evidence connecting any specific individuals to the murders. The first body, Vincent Mell, 34, was discovered at 8:42 a.m. on Sunday in a trash drum, shot 4 times. The last 2 bodies, William Henderson, 26, and George Walsh, 33, were discovered on Friday morning, one floating in the Harlem River and one in a burned-out tenement, both shot execution style after what appeared to be torture in Walsh's case. Despite conducting interviews with more than 50 witnesses, collecting ballistics evidence from 7 crime scenes, and working with prosecutors from the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, the NYPD never made a single arrest in connection with the 8 murders, eventually closing the investigations in early 1936, citing lack of evidence and lack of cooperation from potential witnesses who fear retaliation. Off the record, several detectives told journalists that the department had little interest in solving murders that involved gangsters killing other gangsters, especially when the killings had resulted in the expulsion of white criminals from Harlem and the restoration of black community control over the numbers racket that had been Harlem's most important economic engine during the Depression. Harlem, New York. M. On Saturday, September 14th, 1935, when Arthur Dutch Schultz, Fliegenheimer, 33, walked through the etched glass doors of the Cotton Club at 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue in Harlem, accompanied by 4 bodyguards and 2 associates from his Bronx beer operation, arriving for what should have been an ordinary Saturday night of entertainment, bootleg whiskey, and business discussions in the segregated nightclub that catered exclusively to white patrons, despite being located in the heart of Black Harlem. Schultz was drunk, M, that afternoon at his Newark headquarters, consuming what associates estimated was a full bottle of Canadian whiskey while reviewing financial reports from his Harlem numbers operations that had generated approximately $20 million per year since Schultz had violently seized control of Harlem's policy banks from black operators between 1931 and 1933. The Cotton Club on Saturday night, September 14th, 1935, was packed with approximately 220 patrons, wealthy white New Yorkers from Manhattan's society circles, Brooklyn businessmen, New Jersey politicians, and out-of-town visitors who'd come to Harlem seeking the exotic thrill of watching black entertainers perform jungle-themed revues in a club decorated like a stylized plantation. The house band that night was led by Cab Calloway, whose orchestra had taken over as the Cotton Club's resident performers in 1931 after Duke Ellington's departure. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, illegal whiskey fumes, and the sound of swing music that pulsed through the 700-seat venue. Seated at a corner table near the bar, positioned strategically to observe both the entrance and the performance stage, was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, 29 years old in September 1935, who'd spent the previous 4 years as chief enforcer and lieutenant for Stephanie Queenie St. Clair, Harlem's numbers queen, during the bloody war with Schultz's organization that had resulted in more than 40 murders between 1931 and 1934. Johnson was at the Cotton Club on September 14th, not as a paying customer. The club's whites-only policy prohibited black patrons except in extremely rare cases involving black celebrities like Ethel Waters or Bill Bojangles Robinson, but as a guest of Auni Madden, the gangster who owned the Cotton Club and who maintained business relationships with both white and black underworld figures throughout New York City. Madden, who'd just been released from Sing Sing prison in 1933 after serving time for parole violation, had invited Johnson to the Cotton Club to discuss potential cooperation between Madden's bootlegging operation and the remnants of St. Clair's Numbers organization, which had been largely absorbed by Schultz, but which still maintained underground networks that could be useful to Madden's business interests. Johnson was dressed impeccably, according to witnesses. A dark gray suit tailored by a Harlem clothier on 125th Street, silk tie, polished leather shoes, gold cufflinks that had cost $85, his trademark fedora placed on the table beside a glass of bourbon. He was sitting with two of his most trusted associates, William Bub Hewlett, 31, and Raymond Blue Dixon, 28, both of whom had fought alongside Johnson during the Numbers War and who served as his bodyguards and enforcers. Bumpy looked relaxed that night, recalls Thomas Reed, 45, a Cotton Club waiter who served Johnson's table and who spoke with the Amsterdam News on September 17, 1935, at his home in Harlem. He didn't come to the Cotton Club often because of the whites-only policy, but when Auni Madden personally invited him, it was understood that Bumpy was welcome. Bumpy wasn't there to cause trouble. He was there for business. He was drinking slowly, talking quietly with his people, watching the show. What happened next? According to multiple witnesses who provided consistent accounts to both the Amsterdam News and to investigators from the New York Police Department's Harlem precinct, was a display of racist hatred and public disrespect so extreme that even Cotton Club patrons accustomed to the era's casual racism were shocked by Schultz's behavior. Walking unsteadily, his face flushed red from whiskey and from the September heat, he was immediately recognized by club staff, by other gangsters present, and by several regular patrons who knew him by reputation as one of New York's most violent and unpredictable criminals. Herman Stark, the Cotton Club's manager, greeted Schultz at the entrance and attempted to guide him to a reserved table near the stage, a table that had been held for Schultz and his party. But Schultz wasn't interested in his reserved table. His eyes had locked onto Bumpy Johnson, sitting 30 feet away at the corner table, and according to witnesses, Schultz's demeanor changed immediately from drunk and jovial to drunk and enraged. The moment Dutch saw Bumpy sitting there, his whole face changed, says Margaret Chen, 38, a Cotton Club patron from Manhattan's Upper West Side, who was dining with her husband that evening and who spoke with the Amsterdam News on September 18th. 1935. Dutch's face went from red to purple. He pushed Herman Stark aside and started walking toward Bumpy's table, weaving slightly because he was so drunk, but moving with purpose. Everyone in the club could sense something bad was about to happen. What happened when Schultz reached Johnson's table was described by witnesses as one of the most shocking public confrontations between white and black gangsters that had occurred in Harlem during the 1930 seconds, a confrontation that would set in motion a week of systematic violence that would leave 8 men dead and that would contribute to Dutch Schultz's assassination just 5 weeks later on October 23, 1935. Schultz stopped directly in front of Johnson's table, standing so close that Johnson would have to stand up or lean back to avoid Schultz looming over him. According to witnesses, Schultz's first words were loud enough that every patron within 20 feet could hear them clearly. The racial slur cut through the club's ambient noise, through the music and conversation, causing heads to turn, causing the waiters near Johnson's table to freeze in place, causing several white patrons to gasp audibly at Schultz's crudeness, even in an era when such language was unfortunately common among white New Yorkers. Johnson, according to every witness account, did not immediately respond. He sat perfectly still, looking up at Schultz with an expression that witnesses described as completely neutral. showing neither anger nor fear, just a calm, cold assessment of the drunk white gangster standing over him. Bumpy didn't say anything at first, recalls Thomas Reed, the waiter. He just looked at Dutch, real quiet, real calm. Bumpy's two men, Hewlett and Dixon, they started to stand up, ready to defend Bumpy. But Bumpy held up one hand, very slightly, and they sat back down. Bumpy was in complete control of himself. Schultz, emboldened by Johnson's silence and by his own drunkenness, continued talking, his voice getting louder with each sentence, drawing more attention from other tables, from club staff, from the band members who were still playing but who were watching the confrontation unfold. The specific words that Schultz used, according to 7 witnesses who spoke with investigators and journalists, included multiple repetitions of the word nigger, assertions that black people had no business in white establishments, even in Harlem, statements that Johnson should be grateful that Schultz allowed your kind to run numbers for white bosses, instead of being unemployed, accusations that Johnson was responsible for the deaths of several of Schultz's men during the numbers war, and threats that Schultz could have Johnson killed any time he wanted, but that he was allowing Johnson to live out of generosity and amusement. Dutch was saying the most vile, racist things you can imagine, says Margaret Chen. He was calling Bumpy boy, he was using the N-word repeatedly. He was talking about how black people in Harlem should be happy to work for white gangsters because that's the only way they could make any real money. He said something like, "You think you're tough because you killed some of my collectors? Those were expendable men. You're expendable too, boy. You're only alive because I haven't bothered killing you yet. You and that high yellow bitch Street." The insult to Stephanie St. Clair, who'd been like a mother and mentor to Johnson since 1932, who'd taught him the numbers business and who'd entrusted him with defending her operations during the war with Schultz, seemed to be the moment when Johnson's expression changed, according to witnesses. "When Dutch insulted Madame St. Clair, I saw Bumpy's jaw tighten," says Thomas Reed, "just slightly. His hands, which had been resting on the table, curled into fists, but he still didn't say anything." Schultz continued for what witnesses estimated was 3 to 4 minutes of uninterrupted racist abuse, talking about how Harlem belonged to white gangsters now, how black numbers runners were working for pennies while white bosses made millions, how the only reason Johnson was sitting in the Cotton Club was because Owney Madden felt sorry for him, how Johnson should leave before Schultz decided to have his bodyguards throw him out onto Lenox Avenue like the garbage he was. Finally, after Schultz paused to take a drink from a glass of whiskey that one of his bodyguards handed him, Johnson spoke for the first time. His voice, according to every witness, was quiet, calm, measured, without any trace of emotion or anger, the voice of a man who was making a statement of fact rather than issuing a threat. "Mr. Schultz, you've been drinking, and you're saying things that I believe you'll regret. I suggest you go to your table and enjoy the show." Johnson's tone was so calm, so reasonable, that several witnesses later told investigators they thought Johnson was diffusing the situation, that he was taking the high road and allowing Schultz to save face by walking away from a confrontation that Schultz had started. But Schultz interpreted Johnson's calm response as weakness, as fear, as proof that black gangsters like Johnson understood they couldn't stand up to white gangsters like Schultz in 1935 New York. Schultz said, his voice dripping with contempt, "You think you can tell a white man what to do? You think because Owney lets you sit here tonight that you're equal to white people? Let me explain something to you, nigger. You work for me now. St. Clair works for me. Every black numbers runner in Harlem works for me. I own this neighborhood. I own you. And if I want to come over here and remind you of your place, I'll do that whenever I goddamn feel like it." Then, according to 4 witnesses, Schultz did something that crossed from verbal abuse into physical disrespect, something that would seal his fate and the fates of 8 of his men over the next 7 days. Schultz reached down, picked up Johnson's fedora from the table, and threw it across the room toward the bar, where it landed on the floor near a group of white patrons who were watching the confrontation. "Why don't you go fetch your hat like a good nigger?" Schultz said. laughing at his own gesture, turning to his bodyguards and associates, who forced themselves to laugh along with their boss. The hat throw, according to witnesses, was the moment when the atmosphere in the Cotton Club shifted from tense to dangerous. When Dutch threw Bumpy's hat across the room, everyone in the club understood that this had gone beyond words, says Margaret Chen. A man's hat, especially in 1935, that's personal. That's disrespect on a level that demands a response. And the way Bumpy looked at Dutch after that, I knew someone was going to die. Maybe not that night, but soon. Bumpy's eyes went completely cold. Johnson stood up from his chair, standing to his full height of 5 feet 10 inches, looking directly at Schultz, who was slightly shorter at 5 feet 8 inches. The two gangsters stood less than 2 feet apart, with Schultz still swaying slightly from drunkenness, and Johnson standing perfectly still, perfectly sober, perfectly controlled. What Johnson said next was reported by every witness who was close enough to hear it, and it would become legendary in Harlem within 48 hours, repeated in pool halls and barbershops and policy joints throughout the neighborhood, a warning that would make white numbers runners suddenly nervous about walking Harlem's streets alone. Johnson's voice was still quiet, still calm, but there was something in his tone that made everyone within earshot understand that he wasn't making an idle statement. Mr. Schultz, you came to the Cotton Club tonight, and you disrespected me in public. You used words that no man should use about another man. You insulted a woman I respect and care about, and you threw my hat on the floor like I was a child you could discipline. I'm going to walk over there now and pick up my hat. I'm going to walk out of this club with my men, and then I'm going to teach you a lesson about respect that you'll never forget. You have 7 days to get every single one of your white collectors, your white enforcers, and your white policy bankers out of Harlem. After 7 days, any white man I find collecting numbers, enforcing payments, or running policy in my neighborhood will die. Not as a warning, not as a message, just dead and gone. You've got 7 days, Mr. Schultz. The silence in the Cotton Club after Johnson finished speaking was absolute, according to witnesses. The band had stopped playing. Conversations had ceased. Every patron, every waiter, every performer backstage who'd heard what was happening stood frozen, waiting to see how Schultz would respond. Schultz, drunk and furious and insulted by a black man's threat in front of white witnesses, laughed loudly, a forced, mocking laugh that echoed through the quiet club. You threatening me, boy? You think you can threaten Dutch Schultz? I got 100 men in Harlem. I got cops on my payroll. I got connections to every family in New York. You got what, 20 guys with guns? You're dead, nigger. You just don't know it yet. You and anyone dumb enough to follow you. Johnson didn't respond to Schultz's threats. According to witnesses, he simply walked past Schultz, walked across the Cotton Club floor to where his hat had landed, picked it up, brushed it off carefully, placed it on his head, and walked toward the exit, followed by Hewlett and Dixon, who kept their eyes on Schultz's bodyguards during the entire walk to the door. As Johnson reached the Cotton Club's entrance, he paused and turned back to look at Schultz one final time. 7 days, Mr. Schultz. Starting tomorrow morning, September 15th, at sunrise. Every white man working Harlem numbers needs to be gone by September 21st at sunset. Then Johnson walked out into the Harlem night, leaving the Cotton Club in shocked silence and leaving Dutch Schultz standing in the middle of the floor, still drunk, still angry, still convinced that a black gangster's threats meant nothing, that Johnson would never dare to follow through on his promises, that white gangsters' control of Harlem was absolute and unchallengeable in September 1935. Schultz was wrong. What happened over the next 7 days would become one of the most ruthlessly efficient and meticulously executed gang war campaigns in New York City history. A week of systematic violence that would kill 8 of Schultz's men, terrorize the rest into fleeing Harlem, and demonstrate that Bumpy Johnson's power in his home neighborhood was far greater than any white gangster had imagined. By sunrise on Sunday, September 15th, Bumpy Johnson had assembled 18 men at a warehouse on 132nd Street near the Harlem River, men who'd fought with him during the Numbers War, men who were loyal to Stephanie St. Clair and to Johnson personally, men who were tired of working as middlemen for Dutch Schultz's operation and who were ready to reclaim Harlem's numbers racket for black operators, making phone calls to associates, gathering intelligence about Schultz's Harlem operations, identifying targets, and planning a campaign that would be swift, brutal, and impossible to trace back to Johnson directly. Bumpy didn't sleep Saturday night, Hewlett told the Amsterdam News, talking to numbers runners, policy bankers, beat cops who took payoffs from both sides, bartenders who heard things, prostitutes who knew where Schultz's men spent their money. By sunrise, Bumpy had a complete picture of Schultz's Harlem operation. He knew where every white collector worked, where every white enforcer lived, who picked up money from which policy joints, who transported cash to Schultz's Newark headquarters, who beat up runners, who held back payments. Bumpy knew everything. The first target was Vincent Clutch, Mel, 34, one of Schultz's top collection supervisors in Harlem, responsible for gathering policy receipts from approximately 40 numbers runners throughout the neighborhood and delivering approximately $30,000 per week to Schultz's headquarters in Newark. Mel lived in a rooming house on 115th Street near Fifth Avenue, on the edge of Harlem, in a building that housed several white men who worked for Schultz's operation. To walk to a diner on 116th Street, where he regularly ate breakfast before beginning his Sunday collection rounds. Mel never made it to the diner. .38 caliber revolver fired at close range. Pinned to Mel's shirt with a safety pin was a handwritten note on plain white paper, written in block letters that could not be traced to any specific individual. The note read, "1 down, 6 to go. M." On Sunday, September 15th, caused immediate panic among Schultz's Harlem organization. Word had spread among white numbers collectors that one of their supervisors had been murdered and left in a trash drum with a note suggesting more murders were coming. Several white collectors had called Schultz's Newark headquarters, asking whether they should continue working or whether they should leave Harlem immediately for their own safety. Schultz, according to associates who later spoke with investigators, was initially unconcerned about Mel's murder. Schultz assumed it was a random robbery gone wrong, or perhaps retaliation from a numbers runner who'd been beaten for holding back money. Schultz did not immediately connect Mel's murder to Johnson's threats from the previous night because Schultz still believed that black gangsters like Johnson were too afraid of white gangsters' power and police connections to actually follow through on threats made in public. Schultz told his men to keep working, to show no fear, to demonstrate that Dutch Schultz's organization couldn't be intimidated by one murder, no matter how brutal. That decision would cost 7 more men their lives. Monday morning, September 16th, brought 2 more murders, both executed with the same cold efficiency that had characterized Vincent Mel's killing. The body of Thomas, Red Harrigan, 29. A Schultz enforcer who'd been hired specifically to beat numbers runners who held back payments or who tried to operate independently of Schultz's organization, was found in Marcus Garvey Park, then called Mount Morris Park, near 122nd Street, beaten to death with what investigators believed was a baseball bat, his face unrecognizable from the severity of the blows. On Sunday, September 15th, leaving a bar on 125th Street where he'd been drinking with 2 other Schultz employees. According to witnesses at the bar, Harrigan had been talking loudly about Vincent Mel's murder earlier that day, claiming that whoever killed Mel would be found and killed themselves, that Dutch Schultz would never allow a challenge to his Harlem operations to go unanswered. Monday morning, dumped near a playground, his wallet and identification still in his pocket, ruling out robbery as a motive. Pinned to his jacket was another note, identical in style to the note found on Vincent Mel's body, 2 down, 5 to go. Approximately 2 hours after Harrigan's body was discovered, a second murder was reported. Patrick Sullivan, 42, a policy banker who operated a Schultz-controlled numbers joint in a barbershop on 135th Street, was found shot to death in the basement of the barbershop, killed with 2 shots to the back of the head, execution style, his body positioned in a chair as if he'd been sitting calmly before being murdered. To open for business and had found the basement door unlocked and Sullivan's body in the basement. On Sunday, September 15th, meaning Sullivan had been killed sometime between Sunday evening and Monday morning. The note pinned to Sullivan's body read, 3 down, 4 to go. The discovery of 3 bodies in less than 24 hours, all of them Schultz's men working in Harlem, all of them killed efficiently, and left with notes counting down from 7 to go to 4 to go, finally convinced Dutch Schultz that Johnson's threats were serious, that the murders were coordinated and intentional, that someone was systematically targeting Schultz's Harlem operation with deadly precision. Schultz called an emergency meeting at his Newark headquarters on Monday afternoon, September 16th, bringing together his top lieutenants, enforcers, and policy bankers to discuss how to respond to what was clearly an organized campaign against his organization. According to Arthur Bender, 38, a Schultz associate who later became a government witness in an unrelated case and who spoke to investigators about Schultz's September 1935 operations, Schultz was furious during the Monday meeting, blaming his men for being careless, for not protecting themselves, for allowing black gangsters to kill white men without immediate retaliation. Dutch was screaming at everyone in that meeting, Bender told investigators in 1937. He said we looked weak, that letting 3 men get killed in one day made Dutch Schultz look like he couldn't protect his own people. He wanted to flood Harlem with enforcers, wanted to burn down policy joints run by black operators, wanted to start killing black numbers runners as retaliation. But several of Schultz's more level-headed associates pointed out that sending more white men into Harlem would just provide more targets for whoever was orchestrating the murders, that burning black-owned businesses would bring police attention that Schultz couldn't afford while he was facing federal tax evasion charges, that starting a full-scale race war in Harlem would damage the numbers operations that generated millions in annual revenue. One associate, whose name Bender did not provide to investigators, reportedly suggested that Schultz should pull all white personnel out of Harlem temporarily, let the situation cool down for a few weeks, then return with overwhelming force once they'd identified who was behind the murders and could eliminate the leadership. Schultz rejected this suggestion immediately, saying that withdrawing from Harlem would show weakness, would invite other gangs to move into the territory Schultz controlled, would cost millions in lost revenue from the numbers racket. Instead, Schultz ordered his remaining men in Harlem to work in groups of 3 or more, to avoid being alone at any time, to carry weapons constantly, to report any suspicious activity, and to kill any black gangster they saw who might be connected to Johnson's organization. This strategy, predictable and tactically unsound, played directly into Johnson's plans. Tuesday morning, September 17th, brought news of 2 more murders, both occurring overnight between Monday evening and Tuesday dawn, both executed with the same systematic efficiency that was becoming Johnson's signature during this week of violence. Monday evening, leaving a restaurant on Lenox Avenue. Both men had been shot multiple times, with Kowalski receiving 4 gunshot wounds to the chest and Murphy receiving 3 wounds to the chest and 1 to the head. Their bodies had been wrapped in canvas and hidden behind crates of bootleg whiskey in a warehouse that Schultz used for storing illegal liquor. The detail that the bodies were found in Schultz's own warehouse, that someone had accessed Schultz's property without being detected, that the murders had been committed, and the bodies hidden right under Schultz's organization's nose, sent a clear message that Johnson's network had infiltrated Schultz's operations, that Johnson knew where Schultz stored liquor and counted money and conducted business, that nowhere in Harlem was safe for Schultz's men. The notes pinned to Kowalski and Murphy's bodies read, 4 down, 3 to go, and 5 down, 2 to go. By Tuesday afternoon, September 17th, Schultz's Harlem operation was in complete disarray. White collectors were refusing to go out alone. Policy bankers were closing their joints early and hiding in their apartments. Enforcers who'd previously strutted through Harlem with confidence were suddenly nervous about walking down streets where they'd operated freely for years. Several of Schultz's men quit entirely on Tuesday, telling their supervisors they weren't getting paid enough to risk being the next body found in an alley or warehouse, that whoever was killing Schultz's men was too efficient and too well-informed to avoid, that they were leaving New York until the situation resolved. Schultz responded by offering bonuses to anyone who stayed, promising $500 cash to any man who killed a member of Johnson's organization, threatening that anyone who quit would be considered disloyal and would face consequences. But money and threats couldn't compete with the reality that 5 men had been murdered in 3 days, that the murders were escalating rather than stopping, that the notes suggested at least 2 more deaths were planned before the week ended. Wednesday morning brought a brief respite from the violence. No new bodies were discovered. No new murders were reported. For several hours, Schultz's remaining men in Harlem allowed themselves to believe that perhaps the killing had stopped, that Johnson had made his point with 5 murders and was satisfied that the situation could be de-escalated through negotiation or through police intervention. This hope lasted until Wednesday evening. On Wednesday, September 18th, Francis Frankie O'Brien, 37, one of Schultz's most trusted collection supervisors, was killed while eating dinner at an Italian restaurant on 119th Street near Pleasant Avenue, shot twice in the back while sitting at his table, killed instantly by bullets that witnesses said came from a man who walked in through the restaurant's back entrance, fired 2 shots, and disappeared before anyone could react or identify him. O'Brien had been eating dinner with his wife, Mary, 34, and their 2 children, ages 8 and 6. The shooting, executed in front of O'Brien's family in a public restaurant, demonstrated that Johnson's organization was willing to kill targets anywhere, anytime, that having family present provided no protection, that Schultz's men were hunted wherever they went. The note pinned to O'Brien's body as he lay dead on the restaurant floor read, 6 down, 1 to go. The murder of O'Brien, particularly the fact that it occurred in front of his wife and children, shocked even hardened gangsters who were accustomed to violence. Several associates later told investigators that O'Brien's death was the turning point, the moment when Schultz's remaining Harlem operation realized they were all potential targets, that Johnson's organization didn't care about rules or traditions that usually governed gang warfare, that the only way to survive was to leave Harlem immediately. By Thursday morning, September 19th, more than half of Schultz's white collectors, enforcers, and policy bankers had fled Harlem. Some went to the Bronx. Some went to Newark to work out of Schultz's headquarters. Some quit the organization entirely and left New York. Dutch Schultz, facing the collapse of his Harlem numbers operation, the loss of millions in annual revenue, and the humiliation of being driven out of territory he'd controlled for 4 years, made a decision that would ultimately cost him his life 5 weeks later. Schultz decided to go to Harlem personally on Thursday, September 19th, to kill Bumpy Johnson himself, accompanied by 8 heavily armed bodyguards, driving 3 cars, intending to find Johnson and either kill him or force him to end the campaign of murders that had destroyed Schultz's Harlem operation. Schultz went first to known Johnson hangouts, the policy joints on 125th Street, the barbershops where numbers runners gathered, the bars where Johnson was known to drink, the apartment buildings where Johnson's associates lived. Johnson was nowhere to be found. According to witnesses who saw Schultz's convoy moving through Harlem that afternoon, asking questions, making threats, waving guns, the white gangsters looked desperate and foolish, driving through a neighborhood that had turned completely against them, a neighborhood where every black resident knew that white numbers operators had been driven out, where every policy joint had stopped paying tribute to Schultz's organization, where Johnson's network was so extensive that Schultz couldn't make a move without Johnson knowing about it within minutes. Schultz had given up searching for Johnson and had returned to Newark, frustrated, humiliated, and aware that his Harlem numbers empire was finished. But the week of violence wasn't over yet. Johnson had promised 7 days. Johnson had delivered 6 deaths. There were still 2 days left in the deadline Johnson had given Schultz on Saturday night at the Cotton Club. Friday morning, September 20th, brought the final 2 murders of the week, both occurring overnight between Thursday evening and Friday dawn, both sending unmistakable messages about Johnson's power and about the consequences of disrespecting black gangsters in their own neighborhood. The body of William "Billy" Henderson, 26, a low-level Schultz collector who'd stubbornly refused to leave Harlem despite the previous 6 murders, was found floating in the Harlem River near 145th Street, shot once in the back of the head. His body weighted down with chains that had partially failed, allowing the body to surface. The note attached to Henderson's body, written on waterproof paper and sealed in a glass jar tied to the chains, read, "7 down. Harlem is ours." Approximately 90 minutes after Henderson's body was discovered, police received a report of a body found in a burned-out tenement building on 130th Street near Madison Avenue, a building that had been abandoned for years and that was occasionally used by homeless people as shelter. The body was identified as George Walsh, 33, a Schultz enforcer who'd been responsible for beating numbers runners who tried to operate independently. Walsh had been tortured before being killed, according to the medical examiner's report filed on September 21st. He'd been tied to a chair, beaten severely about the face and body, and finally shot twice in the chest. The note pinned to Walsh's body was longer than previous notes, and its message was explicit and final. 8 dead in 7 days. Dutch Schultz brought this on his men by disrespecting Bumpy Johnson at the Cotton Club on September 14th. 1935. Any white man who tries to run numbers in Harlem after today will die the same way. Harlem belongs to Harlem. The discovery of Henderson and Walsh's bodies, bringing the total death count to 8 men in 7 days, exactly as Johnson had promised, marked the complete collapse of Dutch Schultz's Harlem numbers operation. By Friday afternoon, September 20th, every white collector, every white enforcer, every white policy banker working for Schultz in Harlem had fled the neighborhood. The policy joints that had been paying tribute to Schultz's organization were now paying to black operators loyal to Johnson and St. Clair. The runners who'd been forced to work as middlemen for white gangsters were now working independently or for black bankers. The numbers racket that had generated $20 million per year for Schultz's organization was now generating $0. With all revenue flowing to Harlem-based operators, Dutch Schultz had lost Harlem completely in 1 week. Saturday, September 21st, marked the end of the 7-day deadline Johnson had given Schultz at the Cotton Club. No new murders occurred on Saturday. No white numbers operators were found working in Harlem. The neighborhood had been reclaimed by black gangsters in the most decisive and brutal gang war campaign New York had seen during the 1,930 seconds. Dutch Schultz, facing not only the loss of his Harlem numbers empire but also federal tax evasion charges that threatened him with prison, began making increasingly erratic decisions during the final weeks of September 1935. According to testimony later given to prosecutors by Marty Crompier, a Schultz associate who survived his boss's death. Schultz became obsessed with 2 targets during late September. Thomas E. Dewey, the special prosecutor who was building a criminal case against Schultz, and Bumpy Johnson, the black gangster who'd humiliated Schultz and destroyed his most profitable operation. Schultz proposed to the commission, the governing body of New York's organized crime families, that he be allowed to assassinate both Dewey and Johnson, arguing that killing Dewey would eliminate the legal threat against Schultz and that killing Johnson would allow Schultz to reclaim Harlem. The commission, led by Charles Lucky Luciano, rejected Schultz's proposal to kill Dewey, correctly understanding that assassinating a prosecutor would bring devastating law enforcement attention to all organized crime operations in New York. The commission was more ambivalent about Schultz's desire to kill Johnson, but several commission members pointed out that Johnson had won Harlem through superior strategy and that trying to reclaim the territory would cost more lives and more money than it was worth. Schultz, according to Crompier's later testimony, ignored the commission's decision and began planning both assassinations independently. The commission, learning of Schultz's plans to defy their orders, made a decision that would solve multiple problems simultaneously. They ordered Schultz's assassination, reasoning that killing Schultz would eliminate the threat to Dewey, which would have brought unwanted attention to organized crime, would allow the commission to take over Schultz's remaining operations, and would prevent a war between Schultz and Johnson that might destabilize the entire New York underworld. Entered the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey, where Schultz was conducting business, and shot Schultz and 3 of his associates. Schultz, gut-shot and dying, lingered for 22 hours in a Newark hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness, babbling incoherently to police, who tried to question him about who had ordered his death. During his final hours, according to hospital staff and police officers present, Schultz received a telegram that was read to him by a nurse, Madam Queen, Stephanie St. Clair's nickname, at the age of 33, bringing to an end one of the most violent and controversial careers in American organized crime history. Within a week of Schultz's death, Bumpy Johnson met with Lucky Luciano at a restaurant in Little Italy to negotiate the future of Harlem's numbers racket. The deal they struck would become famous in New York underworld history. Johnson would control all numbers operations in Harlem, ensuring that black operators ran the games and collected the profits, while Luciano's organization would receive a percentage of the profits as tribute and would provide protection from other gangs who might try to move into Harlem. This arrangement, negotiated from a position of strength by Johnson after his week of systematic violence had proven that Harlem couldn't be controlled by outside forces, lasted for decades and established Johnson as the most powerful black gangster in New York City, a position he would hold until his death in 1968. The week of September 15th through September 21st, 1935, when Bumpy Johnson killed 8 of Dutch Schultz's men in 7 days in response to a racial insult at the Cotton Club, became legendary in Harlem almost immediately. The story was told and retold in barbershops, in policy joints, in bars, in churches, becoming part of Harlem's oral history, a story about respect and power, and about what happened when white gangsters underestimated black gangsters' ability to fight back. What Bumpy did to Dutch Schultz's organization wasn't just about numbers rackets or territorial control, says Reverend James Mitchell, 68, a Harlem minister who knew Johnson personally and who spoke with the Amsterdam News on October 2, 1935. It was about dignity. It was about showing that black men in Harlem wouldn't tolerate being called nigger in public, being disrespected, being told they were inferior by white gangsters who thought they owned the neighborhood. The 8 deaths also sent a message to other white gangsters operating in or near Harlem. Several Italian and Irish gang leaders who'd been considering expanding their operations into Harlem in late 1935 quietly abandoned those plans after seeing how efficiently Johnson had destroyed Schultz's organization. The message was clear. Harlem would defend itself, and the cost of trying to control Harlem by force would be higher than the potential profits. The New York Police Department, which had largely ignored the numbers war between Schultz and Street, Clair's organization in the early 1932s, conducted a perfunctory investigation into the 8 murders, but made no arrests. Several detectives later told journalists that they had no witnesses willing to testify, no physical evidence connecting any specific individual to the murders, and no interest in solving crimes that involved gangsters killing other gangsters. The police attitude was basically good riddance, says Thomas Reed, the Cotton Club waiter, who witnessed the initial confrontation. 8 white gangsters were dead, but they were criminals who'd made their money through illegal gambling and violence. The police weren't going to investigate too hard to find their killers, especially when the killers were black gangsters who'd driven white criminals out of Harlem. For Stephanie St. Clair, who'd spent years fighting Schultz's takeover of Harlem's numbers racket, Johnson's week of violence vindicated her long resistance and her refusal to surrender to white gangsters' demands. St. Clair, who would largely retire from active involvement in the numbers business after 1935, told associates that Johnson had done in 7 days what she'd been trying to do for 4 years: prove that Harlem belonged to Harlem, that black operators would control black neighborhoods, that white gangsters' money and political connections couldn't overcome black gangsters' knowledge of the community and determination to defend it. Bumpy did what needed to be done. St. Clair reportedly told associates in late September 1935, according to witnesses who later shared the conversation with historians, "Dutch Schultz thought he could come into Harlem, take over our businesses, insult our people, and face no consequences. Bumpy taught him otherwise. Taught him that respect is earned, not taken. Taught him that black men won't tolerate being treated like children or servants." The Cotton Club, where the confrontation between Schultz and Johnson had occurred, closed permanently in Harlem in February 1936, 5 months after the September violence, ostensibly because of the Harlem race riots that occurred in March 1935, but also partly because white patrons no longer felt safe traveling to Harlem after the murders demonstrated how violent and unstable the neighborhood had become for outsiders. The club reopened in Midtown Manhattan in September 1936, but never regained its earlier success and closed permanently in 1940. For Bumpy Johnson, the week of September 15, 21 St. 1935 established his reputation as the most dangerous and effective gangster in Harlem, a reputation that would serve him well during his long career in organized crime. Johnson's ability to plan and execute a campaign of violence that killed 8 men in 7 days, that left no evidence connecting him to the murders, that achieved its strategic objective of driving Schultz out of Harlem, demonstrated skills that made him valuable to the Italian crime families who would partner with him for decades. Johnson never publicly acknowledged his role in the 8 murders. When journalists asked him about the September 1935 violence, Johnson's standard response was that he had no knowledge of who killed Schultz's men, that he'd been in Newark on business during most of that week, that the murders were likely committed by numbers runners who were tired of working for white gangsters and decided to take violent action independently. But among Johnson's associates, friends, and family, there was never any doubt about what had happened or why. Bumpy killed those 8 men because Dutch Schultz disrespected him in public. William Hewlett told the Amsterdam News in an interview published on October 15, 1935. Bumpy didn't kill them out of anger or revenge. He killed them strategically, systematically, to send a message that would be understood by every gangster in New York. Don't disrespect Bumpy Johnson. Don't insult his family. Don't threaten his community. And especially, don't do those things and think you'll walk away without consequences. Bumpy gave Dutch 7 days to get his men out of Harlem. Bumpy kept his word. 8 men died because Dutch didn't believe that a black gangster could or would follow through on threats made to a white gangster. The telegram that Stephanie St. Clair sent to Dutch Schultz as he lay dying, "As ye sow, so shall ye reap," became famous in Harlem, repeated endlessly as proof that what happened to Schultz was justice, that racist violence and contempt eventually brings consequences, that oppressors will ultimately face judgment for their actions. By the time Schultz died on October 24, 1935, he'd lost everything: his Harlem numbers empire, his reputation as an invincible gangster, his freedom from legal prosecution, and finally, his life. The arc from insulting Johnson on September 14th to dying from gunshot wounds on October 24th was exactly 40 days, a biblical period of trial and judgment that didn't go unnoticed by Harlem's churches and by community leaders who saw Schultz's death as evidence of divine justice as well as street justice. Dutch Schultz came/won into Harlem thinking he was superior to black people. Reverend Mitchell told the Amsterdam News in November 1935. He thought he could insult us, exploit us, control us, because we were black and he was white. He thought racism protected him, that white gangsters were untouchable by black gangsters. He was wrong. Bumpy Johnson showed him he was wrong, showed him in the most direct way possible. 8 men dead in 7 days. That's what Dutch's racism cost him. That's what happens when you underestimate people, when you disrespect them, when you think your skin color makes you invincible. The 8 murders that occurred between September 15th and September 20th, 1935, were never officially solved. No arrests were made. No one was charged with any of the deaths. The New York Police Department closed the investigations in early 1936, citing lack of evidence and lack of witnesses. But in Harlem, in the bars and policy joints and barbershops where men gathered to discuss the neighborhood's business, there was never any mystery about what had happened. Dutch Schultz insulted Bumpy Johnson at the Cotton Club on September 14th, 1935. Johnson promised that 8 men would die if Schultz didn't withdraw from Harlem. 8 men died exactly as Johnson had promised. Schultz lost Harlem, and 5 weeks later, Schultz was shot in Newark and died the next day, never having learned the fundamental lesson that Bumpy Johnson taught him in September 1935. Respect has consequences. Disrespect has consequences. And in Harlem in 1935, Bumpy Johnson was the man who ensured those consequences were delivered with deadly precision. The story of what happened after September 14th, 1935, spread beyond Harlem, beyond New York, becoming part of American gangster mythology, a tale of how a black gangster in a segregated America stood up to white gangsters' racism and won decisively, a tale of 8 bodies in 7 days that changed who controlled Harlem and who would dare to challenge that control. As William Hewlett told the Amsterdam News on September 22nd, 1935, 3 days before Schultz's death and 7 days after the violence began, people will remember this week for a long time. They'll remember that Dutch Schultz called Bumpy Johnson a nigger in public, threw his hat on the floor, threatened him in front of white people. And they'll remember what happened next. 8 dead men, Harlem reclaimed, Dutch Schultz humiliated and destroyed. That's Bumpy Johnson's legacy. That's what happens when you disrespect someone who's strong enough to fight back. Dutch thought he was untouchable. Bumpy proved him wrong. And now every gangster in New York knows, don't mess with Bumpy Johnson. Don't mess with Harlem.